If you could find a seat, we are going to get started. My name is Don Moynihan. I am proud to be the director of the La Follette School of Public Affairs. I am going to say very little except to briefly introduce our panelists and talk about the format of our talk today. Please, if you haven't already, grab some materials from the front desk that will tell you more about what La Follette is doing in terms of public events. If you want to get on our email list, we'd be happy to have you. First of all, let me introduce our panel. I will start directly to my left. Pam Herd is Professor of Public Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison at the La Follette School. She studies issues related to social policy, aging, health, and inequality. Matt Yglesias, our guest of honor here this week, is our writer-in-residence for La Follette. We thank the University of Wisconsin-Madison for making his presence possible here today. Matt co-founded Vox with Ezra Klein and Melissa Bell back in the spring of 2014. He is the co-host of the podcast The Weeds and senior correspondent at Vox on politics and economic policy. And I asked Matt about an introduction. He just said, keep it short. They're already here, so they know what they're getting. Finally, our third panelist is Mark Copelovitch. Mark is professor of political science and public affairs who specializes in issues related to international trade and development and international institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. What I've asked him to do in order to facilitate as much discussion as possible is to give a brief opening statement. Their charge was to think about President Trump as policymaker and give a first-year report card. They tell me the grades are F, D, and A, and you can figure out which one says which when they make their comments. But they're going to talk a little bit about what they think has been most interesting or revealing about President Trump as policymaker in his first year. And then after about 5 or 7 minutes each, we're going to open it up to questions. We hope to get lots of questions from you. I think we will have a roving mic around. So if you have a question, and by question I mean a question, not a statement disguised as a question, we would absolutely love to hear from you. With that, I'm going to invite Matt to be the leadoff hitter, followed by Pam and then Mark.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks everybody for coming out to see me tonight. I'm really glad to be here, thanks to the university. I think, the most interesting thing to say about Trump as policymaker is that he is a president for whom it even makes sense to ask that question, right? You wouldn't say, I think, Barack Obama as policymaker or George H.W. Bush as policymaker, because of course they're policymakers. Like what else would you talk about? It's some other hidden element that you might frame a discussion around. Whereas with Trump, to say, okay, we're gonna talk about Trump as a policymaker is an interesting subject for conversation, because Trump as a political phenomenon is not really about policy in a lot of ways. He's a person from a branding and entertainment industry background who is a media sensation, who excites a lot of passions, both pro and con, for reasons that are very heavily driven by symbolism and atmospherics rather than policy. And of course, nobody should be so naive as to think that politics before Trump was like all about strict, nerdy public policy type stuff. That said, policy was much closer to the core of, I think, what previous recent presidents have been all about than Trump is. That being said, even as Trumpism is not fundamentally about policy, it has policy consequences. That one of the major thematic elements of Trump, I would say, is you let the men with the guns and the badges and the uniforms do what they want, right? They're off the hooks. We trust these kind of authority figures and want to give them autonomy. And that means real things in a variety of different contexts. It's meant to change to the way Immigration and Customs Enforcement does apprehensions and deportations. It matters a lot to people who've been arrested, to people who fear arrest, to people who fear their family being broken up or their community being damaged. It's meant a real loosening of the rules of engagement for the military in various adventures. Barack Obama had the United States engaged in quasi-war type situations in about 7 different countries. And yet he tried to do that in a restrained way, a way that the military perceived as being micromanaged out of the West Wing. Trump does not really micromanage things in general. And again, he wants to let the military do what it wants. That's meant a big uptick in the casualty levels in many of these campaigns, especially including bombing of ISIS targets in Iraq and Syria. It's also meant some battlefield success there. Last, the Black Lives Matter movement was a major sort of focus of news in 2015, 2016. Under Trump, consent decrees that a number of police departments had entered into have been torn up or walked away. That has consequences for the ground. That being said, broadly speaking, if you look at policy change in the United States since the election, it's been very conventional. If you woke up in a coma from 4 years ago and somebody told you, oh, a Republican was elected in 2016 and they had some slender congressional majorities, and you asked that person to guess, like, what kind of things would have happened, I think they would have guessed. Taxes would be cut, social safety net programs will be pared back, but, only somewhat, because it's hard to pare them back. That regulation would become more business friendly. And then you would have told that person, oh, also, guess who the president is? And they'd have been like, maybe Jeb Bush, maybe Scott Walker, and, going through the list. And you tell them Donald Trump, like, holy shit, right? But the actual policy results have been so much less surprising than the fact of who won. And I think that's important to note, because as a candidate, Trump promised actually a very unconventional mix of policies, right? He ran saying that he wasn't going to cut Social Security and Medicaid. He's, in fact, a number of times tried to cut Medicaid. He's proposed scaling back Social Security's disability insurance programs. He said he was going to tax the rich. He, in fact, cut taxes on the rich. He said he was going to close the carried interest loophole. That didn't happen. He said he was going to bring back Glass-Steagall regulations and break up big banks. Obviously, that hasn't happened. So on a whole variety of topics, these things, last, I think by no means least, he said as a candidate, including after the election, that he wanted to cover everyone with health insurance. And of course, that's been completely abandoned. So he put on the table all of these really interesting notions of a very different kind of Republican Party, a very different approach to policymaking. And he hasn't done any of that. And yet, conventional Republican policymaking, whether you like it or not, it's not my cup of tea. But I think you would have to say that it has worked in some sense, right? The stock market is up a lot. Job growth has continued to pace. There's been an increase in consumer confidence, particularly among Republican rank and file people. There's been an increase in business confidence, particularly among small business owners. There's been an increase in business investment, particularly in fossil fuel extraction. So you may or may not enjoy that policy mix, but that's what a Republican would have told you that Republican policies would accomplish, right? That the economy would grow, that fossil fuel extraction would blossom, and all of that is going on. And if you tune out, I normally spend all day with giant computer screens in front of me and all kinds of tweets and weird headlines, and I feel constantly nutty things is happening in the world. Today I was offline almost all day, talking to students, talking to professors. It seemed very chill. Then I wandered in here in the lobby about an hour ago, and I see these CNN chyrons that some nutty conspiracy theorist has been added to the president's legal team. I'm oh my God. But if you don't pay attention, it doesn't seem like anything that dramatic is happening, which is very different from, in 2008, 2009, when the economy was falling apart. You didn't have to be interested in politics to notice that the things politicians were talking about were taking place in the world, whereas now it exists in a kind of strange ether. And I think it all raises the question, to some extent, of whether Trumpism that was proposed in the campaign was there some sense in which that was possible and it simply hasn't happened for contingent reasons, or are there deep, fundamental reasons that it hasn't happened? And I tend to come down on the side of contingency, that Trump offered, among other things, to break down some of the lines of rigid ideological polarization that have existed in the United States, and to be a little bit more eclectic in the way that many people are in their personal preferences. Many people have conservative commitments on cultural and racial issues, and much more moderate ones on economic topics. And Trump put forward the possibility of governing that way, but he can't pull it off, both because he is not personally that engaged with policymaking, but also because he has a lot of vulnerabilities on scandal front, and he requires a unified Republican Party behind him, so he can't operate as a disruptive force, even though he showed in the primaries that he can sort of win as a disruptive force. He can't govern as a disruptor, so the policy making that we've gotten is very conventional, much more conventional than I thought. And he's maybe not the person a Republican would have picked to implement a conventional agenda. So he's maybe just gotten less done than you might have expected, say Scott Walker to do. But the bottom line, Donald Trump becoming president, one of the weirdest, strangest things that's happened in American politics in decades. Donald Trump as policymaker, actually kind of banal.
Pamela?
So to be fair, it's a little hard to assess in some way. It's only been a year, right? It feels a little longer, but it has only been a year, just this week. But what I would say, so I agree with a lot of what Matt just said. I'd make a couple of sort of slight caveats to it. I think one interesting thing is that actually what he said he was going to do at the beginning is really different than what he was trying to do over the past year. So, right, like there was all this talk about preserving Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid in the campaign, but then he made all these attempts to actually basically shrink those programs in a range of different ways throughout the past year. Unsuccessfully, though, right? Largely unsuccessfully in terms of policy change. And what's interesting is it's sort of in contrast to the last Republican that we had in office, which was George W. Bush. In terms of social welfare policy, he actually oversaw the biggest expansion of the Medicare program that we had since its inception. He wanted to actually do a substantial change to Social Security, which would have cost actually $1 trillion, so sort of big government conservative. But all of that was kind of wrapped up in expansions of these social welfare policies, but ways in which actually really benefited the private sector. And Medicare is a great example. Like the private health insurance companies benefited enormously from a bunch of changes that happened to Medicare with the Modernization Act in 2004. So it was not like a small government thing. It was actually sort of a big conservative government thing. In terms of social welfare policy that actually ended up benefiting the private sector in ways. Trump, though, and again, what he has sort of tried to do in practice is reduce a lot of these policies. And as Matt pointed out, pretty unsuccessfully, right? In terms of actual policy change, passing stuff through the House and Senate, not successful. Where he is, I think, getting a little bit of leverage, and this is sort of in the weeds, so to speak, is in implementation. So in kind of, by using executive privilege, basically, he has made it harder for people to access these policies that he was trying to reduce. So the ACA, for example, or Obamacare, he made it really difficult for people to enroll in the program by using kind of administrative barriers or administrative burdens that made it much, much harder for people to get access to the program. And there was a result. We had fewer people enroll in the program than we would have expected otherwise. The Medicaid program, he's using waivers in Medicaid. Now, this is sort of policy change, but like the notion that you could require people to work to receive Medicaid. A couple of states now are able to do that. So it's a bit of a policy change, but to be honest with you, if you talk to people on the ground who actually work with helping people enroll in Medicaid, the work requirements are actually more impactful probably in terms of the burdens that they create for people trying to enroll. Like, how do you document that? the difficulty in terms of documenting and trying to keep up with all that documentation to keep yourself enrolled, even if you're eligible. So I think there's ways in which kind of through executive privilege, by making kind of administrative barriers more difficult for people, he's having some impact. And I think that's the sort of thing actually that over 4 years we'll get a clearer sense of kind of how much of an impact he's actually had. It's a little hard to tell with things like that after a year. Look at it 4 years down the road and look at enrollment in Obamacare and what those markets look like. We may actually see a bigger impact than we might have expected. I'll go on to Mark.
Mark, on the international front?
Great. I'm not used to being the relative skeptic in the room, but I guess I will be for the sake of being provocative. I broadly agree with much of what Matt and Pam said on the domestic policy side. Although, I guess at the risk of dating myself, there's a sort of spinal tap quality to these policies of, these tax cuts go to 11 and it's everything from the Bush administration, even more, I think, extreme. But I spend my days thinking about international relations, and on the international relations side, not so much on policies, but more broadly on the U.S. approach to foreign policy and what it means for international cooperation and international institutions. I have very serious concerns and worry that we've sort of had fundamental change. None of this, Don asked us to talk about things that we've learned over the last year. None of this, I think, is really things we didn't know in advance, but confirmation of a lot of things that that people like me were concerned about. So Trump's approach to foreign policy, I think, is potentially undermining U.S. power influence and our ability to pursue our national interests in the international system. So I want to I'll spend a couple minutes thinking about how I see Trump thinking about international relations, and then how professors of international relations think about international relations and what some of the concerns are. So for Trump, foreign policy, like everything else, is very much about the immediate payoff and about the short term. It's a zero-sum game. If the U.S. is winning, somebody else is losing. And as we have heard repeatedly, the U.S. is losing badly on everything, to China, to Canada, to Mexico, to everybody else. And everything is very transactional and about winning every interaction. Right? So you can think about his handshake engagement with Justin Trudeau at the White House. The other thing is that expertise outside of military and business expertise in the Trump administration, especially on the foreign and economic policy side, is not taken seriously and is not valued. And that's a very big departure from previous administrations of both parties. So what are the implications of that? Policies and institutions that have long-term payoffs and facilitate compromise and enable the U.S. to get things through quiet victories in the international system are not worthwhile. Long-standing commitments and institutions are not valued by the administration. Diplomacy and diplomats and international organizations are sort of four-letter words at this point, I think, in the Trump administration. So as you can imagine, as a professor of international relations, I view things a little bit differently. So here are some of the things we think we know about foreign policy and international relations that don't fit with that type of behavior and viewpoint of the Trump administration. So in IR, probably above all things, we think that very bad things like wars and financial crises happen when there's uncertainty and when everybody acts in a very short-term zero-sum way. And we think about international institutions, alliances, treaties, diplomacy, negotiations, these sorts of things as helping us make long-term commitments and reduce uncertainty and cooperate and achieve mutual gains. And that sometimes involves the U.S. giving something on one issue in order to win on another issue, losing in this round in order to gain in the next round. And that is not very much how Trump views the world. Right? And a lot of the rhetoric on the foreign policy side is about the international order the U.S. puts in and we don't get things out of it. You hear this about the UN, you hear it about trade agreements, you hear it about NATO. And it's very hard to sort of look at the world that was designed by the United States and its allies from 1945 on and not think by any possible measure, geopolitical or economic, that the U.S. is the massive winner. Right, from globalization and the rise of the global economy, from stability in the international system, and the set of institutions of global governance that we have, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, NATO, et cetera, we design them. They overwhelmingly serve our interests. They are instruments of American power. And we get what we want through those institutions most of the time without the sort of saber rattling and overt confrontation with both our allies and our non-allies that enables the US to exercise power. Right? And maintaining those institutions actually requires expertise at both the political level, at the cabinet level, and at the bureaucratic level. Right? And you can think about what has happened with the gutting of the State Department. You can look at the foreign economic policy team of the Trump administration. And it is not clear that the experts in the bureaucratic and diplomatic capacity that the US really needs to exercise its power is there. Right? We've heard a lot about the adults in the room. And I think on the security side, there have been adults in the room, though some of them are now departing. But if you think about, things are sort of okay on the foreign policy side because Kelly is there and because Mattis is there and because McMaster is there. You can look over on trade policy and economic policy and the set of actors are there. And they are not people that you would look at and say, these are the adults in the room managing responsible economic policy. So I'm concerned not so much about what is going to happen this year, what has happened over this year. I sort of share a lot of what Pam said about what's going to happen in the next 4 years, what would happen over an 8-year period. The thing that I'm more concerned about is that the US's credibility in the international system has been severely, severely damaged. We have openly cast doubt on the value we place in the possible future membership that we're going to maintain in NATO, in the World Trade Organization. We backed out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The world is wondering, and my European colleagues sort of talk about this all the time when I see them recently, the world is wondering whether the US is a reliable partner on the international stage anymore. And so I worry a lot less about the kind of policy change, but that we can't walk that back, right? A future president of either party is now entering international negotiations where the US has a reputation and has openly said we don't necessarily value these institutions anymore. And that has cast our allies to start looking about for alternative institutions, for alternative countries to lead. And once that happens, it may be hard to get back the position of dominance and power that we've enjoyed over the last 70 years.
So those are our opening statements. We'll take questions now from the floor. If you have a question, raise your hand and we will try to get a mic in your general neighborhood.
Yeah.
All the way in the back, sir. You may yell if you wish.
Nice, easy question.
Why should the U.S. be the supreme power in the U.S. in the world anyway?
So there's a question about how you measure power and how you measure hegemony in international relations. I mean, by any measure, the U.S. is still the dominant power in the international system. In nominal size, the Chinese GDP and the American GDP are the same size.
Can you let him answer the question, and then we'll move on and take other questions? I want to give a chance for multiple people to respond.
So as I said, there's a lot of way to measure power. If you think about voting power in international institutions, in the UN, in the IMF, in the World Bank, if you think about relative military capabilities, if you think about ability to attract international finance, the US is still the leading power, the hegemon in the international system. It's not 1945 anymore, right? But the sort of declines of American hegemony are probably exaggerated. But at the same time, that also rests on the credibility of American commitments to participate in, to fund, to abide by the rulings of the international institutions and organizations that we've created, the treaties we've signed with our NATO allies. And while we may be big and powerful, you're right, we're not as big and powerful relatively as we were 40 years ago. And if we are seen by other countries in the international system as not living up to our commitments, then there's a high likelihood they're going to look elsewhere for credible partners.
On to another question right here in the front where I can hear you easily, sir.
I'll wait.
put the toothpaste back into the tube once it's squeezed out.
I mean, I tend to think that on a lot of the tax and the sort of program implementation stuff Pam was talking about, you know, if Trump serves 4 years, that stuff will be largely, if not overwhelmingly, reversed, although it will make Democrats think a little bit differently about how they themselves want to structure programs. You know, 8 years is enough time to entrench things. With the State Department, though, is, I think, actually a more difficult question because, you know, people will leave, new people could be brought on by a new administration, but to an extent, you can't revive the sense that the Foreign Service is an institution with prestige. So, like, one small thing is there are a lot of Senate-confirmed political appointed jobs in Washington. And the president can pick whoever he wants for those jobs. But by tradition, a lot of lower-level political appointments in the State Department go to career Foreign Service officers. That's not like a law, but it's what presidents have done. And that makes that particular arm of government service a little bit more august and elevated than working at HUD, say, where the political appointments all go to political people. And you can't put that toothpaste back in the tube, right? Once you create a situation in which the Republican Party is committed to, I mean, it's not just people are gone, but it changes the dynamic so that, like, the State Department is no longer respected in that way. A career in Foreign Service no longer means what it once did. And that's very hard to undo unless there's a sharp political change of some kind.
Yes, a question about the kinds of media in which Trump has excelled. He's excelled in television, obviously, with the episodic reality TV sense, but and his associates have excelled with Facebook, as we're learning today, of Cambridge Analytica. But I'm wondering about Twitter in particular. If he were to deny Twitter, I'll be very short here, what would be happening to his administration? He's used it to hire, fire, but he's also been using it in a way that goes against the Twitter policies of fair use and all that. He's obviously gotten a number of complaints, but if it would be some type of an uprising, could we get him off of Twitter? In which case, could he become a master of another media? Thank you.
I mean, it's hard to imagine that anybody would ban the President of the United States from a communications service, which he uses a lot, right? Like, firing your Secretary of State with a tweet is, like, wild. But also, it's sort of very flattering to Twitter, which in many ways, you know, is not nearly as successful a company as some of its peers. And Trump could fire secretaries of state with a Facebook post, or he could put it on Tumblr, or he could do an Instagram of a handwritten note. You know, people would follow the president to whichever platform he wanted to migrate to. So I don't think. Oh, would he be as good? I don't know. You know, that's an interesting one.
I do know that when Twitter advertises overseas, when I travel around the world, you see them featuring President Trump in their ads for why you should be on Twitter.
Yeah.
And so he is part of their sales pitch for why you pay attention to Twitter. It seems very unrealistic that they would take that comparative advantage they have out relative to other social media platforms.
Yeah, they need him.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Right.
Yeah, so Matt spoke a little bit earlier on kind of like whether it was possible to reestablish broken norms a little bit in your answer to the previous question. And so kind of building off of that, I was wondering, you know, sorry, I'm blanking. Oh, God. Yeah, so I was wondering if the increased polarization we've seen over the last like 10, 20 years or something, some of it obviously predating Trump, you know, some of that is at least like better sorting ideologically or something like that. So I guess my question is, when building a government for the next period, should the goal be to try to reduce polarization in any sense, or should it just be to try to create a government that is better equipped to handle it with lower veto or fewer veto points or something like that?
provocative leading question. I know, as you probably have guessed, I do think that we need to, accept a more polarized political dynamic, try to make institutions work. Otherwise, I was saying, one of the things you see in Trump's career, right, is that he has not fulfilled this potential, but he suggests the possibility that the electorate would favor a somewhat less polarized argument around economic policy issues. That he went, not just, you can, candidates all the time, they say things in general elections that then maybe don't come true when they're governing, and, you're trying to win. But he said in a Republican primary that he was going to be more supportive of certain kinds of public programs than he really has been. And that suggests that there's something going on in the internal dynamics of the Republican Party that is other than the voters just happen to hold right-wing views. And I think Larry Bartels put out a paper recently showing that Republicans, grassroots Republicans, are very united around cultural conservatism, but have some disagreements about economics. And with Democrats, it's the reverse. There's like a strong unity around progressive economics, some internal incoherence around cultural issues. But you see that I think the donor structures and the elite structures in both parties are the opposite of that almost. And it's building a tension into the system that I think wasn't evidently there 5 years ago.
He actually picked up the campaign support for Social Security and Medicare coming from him throughout that campaign was really interesting, because it's something that Democrats in particular are not particularly bright about, which is that those programs have, they're 60% of the federal budget, and they have enormous support in the public. So even when you poll Tea Partiers, 60% of them will say we spend the right amount of money on Social Security and Medicare. So it's interesting to me. Like, I do think, to back that up, like, there's data that supports the perspective that a moderate perspective can probably do reasonably well.
Yeah, I think the problem, though, of course, is our political institutions, right? It drive us to a two-party system where you have, winner take all, and there is populism on the left and populism on the right, and you could imagine with a different set of electoral institutions that we would have a centrist populist coalition that would cut across, right, these different social and cultural cleavages, but our system is not set up that way. We don't have a sort of European parliamentary system where you're going to get 5 or 6 parties, and you could imagine new coalitions of parties coming together. And so, right now it seems very much the cultural issues have pushed the polarization, and the economic issues have not led to a coming together in the center.
So this is, I guess, an IR question, but you talked a little bit about how the dynamics of partnerships in longstanding organizations might be changing, and I just wondered to what extent you think those changes are going to be long-term, or if other governments are going to be reacting in sort of a short-term way to just deal with the administration now.
Yeah. So I think everybody is hoping that what Pam said is what's going on, that we're sort of buying time and waiting for the U.S. to come back on the world stage, and we're just going to go back to the status quo. So in my less pessimistic moments, that's sort of what I think is happening. And you see that a little, for example, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So the U.S. backs out of this Pacific Rim Trade Agreement, and the other 11 countries are going forward, and they are leaving open in the treaty they just signed, basically the opportunity for a future U.S. administration to come back in. The problem also, of course, though, is then we are now joining institutions as the follower rather than the leader. And so you have 2 problems. You have one is what I said before, which is if we come back, now you have a credibility and a reputation problem. And maybe over 15 or 20 years of good behavior in IR, then that sort of goes away and everybody says we're back to where we were previously, though the power dynamics may change. But also, the U.S. is now going to be joining a trade agreement that the Canadians redesigned after they left and put in a bunch of clauses that the U.S. didn't want there in the first place. And so if we are coming to international organizations and institutions late, we're no longer setting the agenda. Right? And as much as Trump talks about we're always losing, we're making concessions, people are free riding in NATO, The US pretty much in international organizations and international negotiations, we get what we want 95% of the time. And we get to design what these things look like, and we give a little bit here or there, but basically there's a new treaty, there's a new organization. It looks very much a reflection of American interest in power. And so if we're in a new world where sometimes we're gonna lead, but other times we're gonna follow. So I think people are kind of feeling out, do we have to go our own way or not? The optimistic thing is, you know, sort of one way you would look at this is say, the US is gonna pull back and globalization is gonna collapse and the international order is gonna collapse. And I think those really pessimistic conclusions are exaggerated. What we're seeing is the rest of the world is moving on, right? Japan and the EU are signing a trade agreement. You have this new Trans-Pacific partnership. The world is gonna move ahead and the US is no longer gonna be at the head of the table anymore.
I also think, you know, I think in the international realm, it's important to remember the backdrop of the Bush administration, which at the time was perceived as a very disruptive force by some of our allies, right? I mean, you know, invading Iraq, obviously, it's some of the commentary that seemed to be stirred at, like, sowing dissension inside the European Union. And then the Obama administration was meant to be a return to normalcy, right? And what Trump signifies is not just a further disruption, but the fact that Trump follows Bush casts into doubt the fact that a subsequent administration can fix anything, right? There was a desire to believe that Obama's was restoring the old order the way other people wanted. He was given this sort of preemptive Nobel Peace Prize to try to, you know, tempt everybody back onto that line. And Trump's election shows that that did not work, right? And so you can look at whoever, you know, President Harris can do whatever she wants, and everybody is going to have to look at it and say, like, we don't really know what's going on with the Americans, right? Like, they could elect any kook, like, crazy things could happen all the time, because Trump is an outlier, but he's not such an extreme outlier that he can be written off as a one-off kind of thing.
Right. You can play the aberration card once.
Right.
But it's hard to play.
Right here in the middle.
The attacks on the media really escalated during the George W. Bush years, and they continued through the Obama years. And it's been the smoldering fire trying to make people say you can't trust anything the media says, basically. And the Russians kind of putting fuel on that fire, taking advantage of that. What do you think the media landscape will be 3 years from now, around the time of the next election?
I think that's yours, man.
Yeah, you know, this is an interesting. Trump has a little bit of a reverse Midas touch in terms of these things, and public confidence in the media, which has been quite low for a long time, has actually risen under the Trump administration because it's made liking the media cool again in certain kinds of circles. I would also say, you know, my colleagues who do more hard scrabble investigative reporting than I do always want people on these panels to note that the Obama administration's leak prosecutions were much more aggressive than any previous president, and so far more aggressive than anything Trump has actually done. Now, Obama was incredibly respectful about journalism, you know, and seemed to really, like, he had favorite magazine writers and things like that, and was like the kind of person journalists would enjoy, because he seemed to, he would be like upset about critical articles appearing in publications he respected in the way that, like, I would be upset if somebody wrote something mean about me. Whereas with Trump, it's like, it's all for show, right? And he clearly is not like a real reader of things. So, no, I mean, but seriously, you know, it's, he, by all accounts, he watches a lot of cable news. And some people do that and think of that as a good way to get information about the world. But, like, that's a terrible way to get it. You know, someone who had any kind of actual opinions about journalism would just not do that, with all due respect to my friends in television. So But I really think that's an area in which you see just like an enormous disjoint between the atmospherics of Trump and the reality. Like, the media is fine in many ways. Like, Trump is great for ratings, he's great for clicks. The media is also facing profound challenges that have to do with Facebook and Google's share of the digital advertising pie, and like are nothing to do with Trump. Trump has eased off some problematic things that Obama did from a repertorial standpoint. And, you know, there's like a lot of big, difficult questions about journalism. Like, will there be any local reporters covering Milwaukee City Hall 15 years from now? But they have, I think, like nothing to do with Donald Trump.
Mike is over there, sir.
Hi, so I'm wondering if, so all three of you have talked about sort of the decline of institutions, the prestige of institutions, and I think we can see how that affects policy on the international level, for example, but I'm wondering if you could also talk about, giving your policy expertise, about the kind of structural relationship between a decline in prestige and what that means for policy in terms of what policies can be produced, or how existing policies might be affected, those kinds of things.
I guess I can talk a little bit the corner of the world, the policymaking world that I know, which is on monetary policy and financial regulation. So if you, in much the way that Matt was talking about the State Department, you know, another line of prestigious jobs was to work at the Fed, at the SEC. Those were often people who were academic economists, right, and who sort of made research careers that way and moved up into higher level positions. And, you know, one thing that you've seen with this administration, although it's a sort of ongoing trend over time, is those are more politicized appointees too, and they're often people coming from, you know, say the banking sector or Wall Street, or without a macroeconomic background. And I think it has similar effects, right? So what you worry there is people who are really experts in that field, that you're losing the institutional memory, you're losing the expertise, you're politicizing these types of appointments, and you're biasing policy. There's sort of a worry about regulatory capture, right? Monetary policy, regulatory policy is going to be made by Wall Street bankers for Wall Street bankers, and it's not balanced by having a Ben Bernanke and a Janet Yellen. And you know, and you also see, you know, the most qualified Fed chair ever, right, who was the person probably most right about monetary policy making over the last decade, doesn't get reappointed, right? Because she's a woman, basically, right? Not because of any expertise. And so she's replaced by someone who is very highly regarded, in Jerome Powell, but doesn't have nearly the background or the expertise. And that sends, I think, a very strong signal in the future of, you know, if you're someone who is on the short list and really qualified to go run the Fed, would you want to do that? Maybe not, in the same way if you're somebody thinking about, do I want to have a diplomatic career? Maybe I'm not going to go that route.
I'll just say this quickly. I think one thing that I wonder about, so people have focused a lot on the State Department in terms of the, you know, exodus from the State Department and the implications of that. I think in general, Americans underestimate the quality of our civil service. So the MPAs in this room hear this. There's a real tendency to underestimate how good American civil service is, especially at both the federal and in states like Wisconsin. And it's other agencies are experiencing this too. NIH is experiencing loss, difficult, they're not able to hire now. The Social Security Administration has actually been getting hammered for about 8 years now. At some point, I do wonder how hard it's going to actually be to recover some of that expertise, and where people really will start feeling it. People are feeling it in the Social Security Disability Program, actually, in terms of the loss of administrative capacity at the Social Security Administration. So I kind of wonder over the long term how much hammering these institutions can take before there's like long-lasting damage.
I agree with that. I do want to draw a distinction, which is that one thing that's happening is a financial squeeze, right? So Social Security Administration has, dating back to basically the Republican takeover of Congress, suffered a lack of resources. And that is simply making it difficult for them to do their jobs at an adequate pace. A different thing is that, you know, I heard from a senior civil servant who works in the Treasury Department. He told me that he has stopped attending the senior staff meetings at Treasury, that people used to fight to get in them. He was really excited when he was like first in at Jack Lew's senior staff meetings, but that he no longer bothers to attend because the secretary is not interested in hearing from people what it is they are working on, that he likes to tell weird stories. And that's a different kind of thing, right? Of saying that, like, look, people who used to think that this was like a career that they were taking pride in has become something that is disrespected and devalued because, you know, the money stuff can be turned around if it's turned around in a timely manner. Some of these other things, it's like, it's hard, right? And it's hard to gauge, but it's always been the case that some agencies were very partisan and would ping pong a lot, and people understood that, whereas others were like the big prestige agencies where there was more continuity between the administrations. And Trump personally does not believe in the value of civilian government or academic expertise as seen by, he's going to bring a CNBC pundit in to run his National Economic Council, because what he wants is a highly effective television surrogate. That's how he thinks of building a team. He doesn't think of building a guy who will be highly effective at marshaling the resources of the federal government. And that has both kinds of effects are bad, but they're different, profoundly different in a lot of ways.
Hi. So Matt touched on this a little earlier about how Trump isn't really teaching the world how bad of a president he is, but more how flip-floppy America itself is. So I'm wondering, what's really worse in the long term, Trump being president or the polarization within our government? Like, we're going to have every 4 years, it could be a Trump, it could be Obama, it could be Bernie Sanders in the future. Like, how are businesses going to react to that? How is that going to affect our international relations? And does the government need to become more immune to this polarization and flip-floppiness from the higher ups?
I mean, you know, here's where I do think it's worth saying that a lot of us were thinking in the fall of 2016, you know, if Donald Trump gets elected president, the stock market's going to crash, you know, blah, 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 blah. And none of that has happened, right? Now, like, I maintain significant worries, you know, put a pin in all this, and I look at Puerto Rico, and you know, I don't want to say, like, everything's fine, but particularly if you've been, like I have, like, very critical of Donald Trump for, like, many, many years, you do also have to concede that, you know, on some level, firing Janet Yellen for no good reason is a bad look. But Jay Powell's a perfectly good Fed chair, right? For a job where it was really important that he pick somebody good, he didn't pick a cable news pundit. James Mattis is, like, a good, well-qualified defense secretary. We're not embroiled in crazy wars. We're right. We're gonna have to wait and see. You know, like, I have a lot of worries, but it is worth, you know, giving due, right? If you're a rank and file Trump voter, if you always believed in Donald Trump and you heard these ninnies in the liberal media, you know, with their fake news warning of gloom and doom for years, you're looking around saying, like, where's the gloom? Where's the doom?
I mean, I think as we were talking about before, the policy cycling has been happening in the U.S. for 50 years, right? And it happens in most countries that, you know, the government falls and there's a different composition of parties that come into power, and policy, you know, for domestic policy, that often means stuff doesn't get done and the can gets kicked down the road. But I think the big thing is what we've been talking about, which is there was always a bureaucracy that more or less kept the ship of state in all of the cabinet departments running, and on some level, the State Department and ambassadors in this sort of foreign policy apparatus, there was a lot of continuity across administrations, right? And you saw this with think about how the transition happened from Bush to Obama. right? And the amount of hours that went into smooth hands-off of policies at the international level. And that's something that very clearly didn't happen here. So I think this undermining of the bureaucracy and the sort of parts of Washington that are run by high-level officials with a lot of expertise and long-term time horizons. The politicians change all the time, but we're whittling away at that expertise and putting more political appointees in. And then that makes the danger of the cycling and the credibility problems that I was talking about, I think it makes it more severe going ahead.
Sounds like you were arguing for the deep state at this point.
A little bit.
Policy on other policies, and now even in foreign policy with the appointment of I'd like to cross on that. That to me is so.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I mean when I say that Trumpism is not really about policy, right? It's not like Trump has repealed the Civil Rights Act or something, but he has lent a respectability to overt racism in a way that previous presidents, I don't want to say no previous president had, like Woodrow Wilson certainly did, but it was a long time ago, right? And he has put that on the table in a way that is both disturbing but also non-specific. You know, it's hard to get a handle on exactly what it amounts to. Yes. Yeah. But I mean, I think more telling than that is something like we've had this string of bombings in Austin now, and we don't know exactly what the deal is, but he hasn't said anything about it. Whereas we know that if a Salvadoran kid on temporary protected status murdered somebody somewhere in Indianapolis, he would be tweeting about it constantly and would dominate the news, right? He would be framing this immigration crisis as a top-level national issue, whereas this string of, I don't know, it seems like some kind of white supremacist terrorist campaign, and like he doesn't care, he doesn't want us to know about it, and the implications of that for society seem very grave, and they can be grave even if no policy is made behind them, right? I mean, the president plays a head of state role in the United States as well as a head of government role, and Trump is playing it in a very irresponsible way that we don't have modern precedent for, and that's the most, not really what we've been talking about tonight, but it's what most discussions of Donald Trump are about, and it's what most political mobilization for and against him is about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to note that it's not like this is new stuff. It's just been beneath the surface, basically. Prior politicians, people didn't talk about the Southern strategy, even though everyone acknowledged that that was a mechanism by which Republicans began to take back the South from Democrats, was by using race as a wedge issue. But they did it using coded language, or one sort of striking example is Ronald Reagan announced his candidacy for presidency on the step house of the Neshoba County Courthouse, which was in Mississippi, and which was where Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodman were taken from and then ultimately murdered in the swamps in Mississippi. And there's tons of examples of that low-lying stuff going back, decades, basically. And he just opened it up to say it openly, and we know that's had consequences. We know it's had consequences in a resurgence of the KKK, a resurgence in hate groups, and it's had, really serious consequences.
Hands, not many female hands. I would take a female hand if one was up right now.
No pressure, though.
Okay, in the absence of that, you, sir, right there.
I mean, there are two separate issues. So on the nuclear weapons side, you know, you worry with this administration that the popular rhetoric of the Iran deal being a bad deal and walking away from this deal that was, you know, tediously negotiated and seems to be working, that we are undermining existing international agreements. I think the problem on climate change is much more one of the concern that we were talking about a few minutes ago of kicking the can down the road, right? So there's just not going to be a lot of progress on global climate change unless the US and China and the EU and Japan and Australia are all at the table together. And so we're waiting another 4 years at least until dealing with this seriously. We sort of all know what's going on and how serious a problem is. That's where the gridlock, right, or the sort of lack of engagement on this issue for another 4 years, I think, is a really big problem.
Yeah, I mean, you know, climate is an important case of the sort of duality of the Trump era, because there's probably nothing he is doing that poses a greater long-term sort of damaging risk than the fulsome embrace of fossil fuel extraction. At the same time, of all the different aspects of Trumpism, that's the one that is the absolutely most banal in the core of Republican Party orthodoxy, right? Like, you could not pick a single Republican office holder anywhere in America who would not have exactly the same climate policies as Donald Trump. And so it's an area in which the Trump administration's policies are very important, but it's like truly nothing to do with Donald Trump, right? It's like very orthodox, very Republican, and it poses a real question for what you can do at all in America, because policy change happens over the long term because policies have a certain amount of stickiness to them normally, right? I mean, we talk about back and forth and so on and so forth, but, you know, Medicare is created and it changes a lot since it was created, but it doesn't just go away. Whereas, you know, most of what it seems like if a Democrat came in and they created a cap and trade scheme or something like that, like it would be gone 4 years later, right? There is no partisan consensus at all on the idea that it would be good to reduce carbon dioxide emissions at all. So then there's like a whole fascinating conversation among environmental activists about exactly what you should do and how much and blah, blah, blah. But like, there's no buy-in from Republicans, and the way the political system operates, like you can't do things on that basis. It's not going to work, and it's a big problem.
Hand towards the front. Congratulations. Sorry. The mic coming, and this may be the very last question, so no pressure at all.
Yeah. Better be good.
So my question is the response from the Democrats. I know a lot of younger people are not happy with how
This is an excellent final question, so I'm going to ask all of the panelists to think about this. We've talked mostly about Trump. What does the landscape for Democrats look like for the next 4 years? They're winning these one-off elections here and there. There's some expectation of regaining seats in the fall, but Jamie Dimon, I think, came out and said there's simply no one on the Democratic side who's going to be able to stand against Trump in 2020.
Sure, he would know.
So, is that pessimism justified, or can Democrats expect to comfortably retake the White House in 2020? And what should they do to get there? That's a lot.
That was a lot. So I'm figuring it out all on
Yeah.
this. I mean, directly on the question. So, you know, I guess one thing I would hope is that there was a lot of talk on the Democratic side, which was split about, it doesn't make a difference. Should we, if it's not Bernie Sanders and it's Hillary versus Donald Trump, it doesn't make a difference. I think one of the things, that we are seeing is it makes a very big difference. So, your preferred Democrat versus someone who's not a Democrat is a big difference. On what to do, this is above my pay grade. I think the lesson of these special elections, so I'm sort of a structuralist and an institutionalist, and I think that when the economy is doing well, incumbents tend to win. On the other hand, when the president is highly unpopular, right, the midterm elections tend to be a bloodbath. We're going to see what's going to happen. I would hope one of the lessons that we've seen of the last year is the Democrats should be running everywhere, right, even if they are not winning. They are, fighting everywhere and trying to maximize turnout. I think there's a lot of tension going on right now between should the Democrats reach out to the white working class, should the Democrats try and increase the minority turnout that fell way off in Philadelphia and Milwaukee and Detroit and lots of cities in the United States. And I think the answer to that is you need to get out everywhere. But in terms of who is going to run, what they should do, that is as I said, way above my pay grade.
So I think the difficulty I think you've seen Democrats do very well in a lot of special elections, and you've seen that as long as Democrats don't have to pick a national party leader, they can pick people who are reflective of the local area that they're running in. So you go, like Connor Lamb, he's running in suburbs and exurbs of Pittsburgh. It's like basically an all-white constituency, so they get a white guy. He campaigns, not like saying anything bad on racial or social justice issues, but just like not highlighting them, right? Like he's a white person talking to white people about white people's problems, and it does well in a white constituency, right? And that's great. And then if they have to run someplace else, they'll run somebody else and they'll do something else. The problem is, nationally, the Democratic Party is obviously the party of non-white people in a country where the electorate is mostly white and where the Electoral College map overweights white voters. And so you need to address white people as like, I am going to help you with your problems about things, and not just the problems of minorities. You don't want to, as a Democrat, you don't want to portray electoral politics as a proxy battle about race because you have the smaller half of that cookie, right? So Hillary Clinton prevailed against Bernie Sanders very specifically by marketing herself as the candidate for non-white voters, which was clever, and it worked, and she beat him because African Americans in the South in particular have enormous weight in Democratic Party primaries, but it then became a crippling disadvantage in the election where she couldn't quite shake that. I think that Barack Obama, shows an effective political path for Democrats, which is to actually be a non-white person, which meets the representational desires of non-white people to an extent, and then lets you focus your messaging on the idea that, like, I have ideas for everybody. So, like, he would say, like, I'm not running to be the president of Black America. I'm running to blah, 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 blah. And, like, African Americans are still like, oh, this is a historic moment. I saw in my neighborhood in Washington, it was predominantly African American, and all the, Black moms are buying newspapers, like, and share with their kids. It was a huge moment, right? But he didn't pitch himself that way. Whereas, like, Hillary is obviously a white person, but she's running as like the black candidate, and that doesn't work. It's like it's too turned around. And I think Democrats are ultimately going to need to become more comfortable actually recruiting and running candidates of color to then pitch the party to swing voters, right? Whereas this sort of like performatively woke white nominee, it doesn't work. Like it's fine when you're just running in an all-white district, right? But I think you're going to see Claire McCaskill will probably have one of the toughest Senate campaigns because Missouri was a Trump state. It wasn't the Trumpiest state, but again, the demographics of that state are she's really going to need a strong African-American turnout out of St. Louis, out of Kansas City to win, but then she also has to win over culturally conservative voters. And, you know, again, like she's white, and it's going to be a real pretzel to be like, you know, I'm everything. Whereas I think you could imagine maybe like a black guy from St. Louis being the nominee and then coming out to the more rural, whiter areas and being like, you know, I know you and I look different, but I have this great plan about your Social Security and your health care and blah, 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 blah. Whereas if McCaskill can't downplay the racial issues because she needs to represent her core constituents. And that's a big problem for her. And it's a problem for Democrats nationally. A black woman. Earlier, I had my hypothetical President Harris.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
I tipped my hand there.
I'll just sort of say real quickly, I'm in the camp of like build the pool, and the fact that the issue is not just for Democrats, the issue is not just the Trump presidency, right? The issue is at the state level, at the local level, and I think we are sort of seeing this. I mean, I've never known anyone who ran for office. My aunt is running as a Democrat in upstate New York in a swing district, a Senate district state office. She's the Democratic Party person for that seat. She's probably going to win. We have a friend from grad school in Atlanta. I mean, I just sort of feel like, and I'm not just anecdotal here. We're seeing this. We're seeing this resurgence of interest among Democrats in actually running at all different levels. And I actually think it's, to be honest with you, if it seems to be just as important here to be building the pool of potential people who could eventually be at these more national, federal levels.
I have a partial answer to your question as well, which is there's this famous hypothesis in political science about the party decides, and one of the proposed lessons from the last round of the election is that the Democrats gave the party too much power and superdelegates had too much power. We need to open the process up in the way that Republicans did in their primary process, when the party didn't really have quite as much power. It was 17 people competing, and the winner of that process was Donald Trump. So we will see which path the Democrats take, but it's not necessarily clear that redesigning the structural mechanisms of choice will give you the preferred outcome that you would like to generate in the first place. Yeah. Let me stop there. We're 10 minutes past the hour. I want to advertise that we have some loaves and fishes over there, in that it's an inadequate amount of food for the size of the audience, but we were surprised by how many people we got here. We also have a cash bar if you want to have a beer at the back. We'll be hanging around for a little bit if you want to pitch your policy ideas to Matt, if you want to get to work in Vox. He would love to hear your ideas. Maybe you should buy him a beer as you're doing that in order to facilitate the transaction. Otherwise, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking the panel.